The great hall of Calderwin Palace was full of light and gold that morning. Every noble family in the kingdom had gathered under its tall windows, dressed in their finest silks, waiting for a moment they believed would be simple and joyful. Lady Seraphine Adair stood near the front of the crowd, her hands folded calmly in front of her, though her heart was beating faster than she wanted to admit. Today was supposed to be the day her future became certain. Today, Duke Alaric Voss was expected to stand before the king and confirm the marriage arrangement his late father had made 3 years earlier, binding their two families together. Seraphine had waited a long time for this. She was not a woman who loved attention, but she had come to accept that her life would soon change in front of everyone she knew. She smoothed the front of her pale blue gown and looked toward the throne, where the king sat with quiet patience, and where Duke Alaric now walked forward, his boots echoing against the marble floor. He looked strong and confident, as he always did. His dark coat was perfectly fitted, his expression calm, almost bored. Seraphine had met him only a handful of times since his father's passing, and each time he had said little to her. She told herself that was simply his nature, a serious man, not unkind, just distant. She believed that today would finally give her the chance to know him better, now that their futures were about to be joined. But when Alaric reached the center of the hall and turned to face the crowd, something in his eyes had changed. It was not nervousness. It was something colder. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "I cannot honor the arrangement my father made." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Seraphine felt her breath catch, but she did not move. "I do not intend to marry Lady Seraphine Adair," Alaric continued, his tone flat and certain, as though he were announcing something as simple as the weather. "She is not fit to stand beside the name of my house. I ask the crown to release me from this arrangement." The hall fell into a stunned hush. Seraphine felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Her cheeks burned, but she forced herself to stand tall. She would not let them see her shake. She would not give the whispering court a single tear to talk about at dinner that evening. Alaric did not look at her again. He gave a short bow to the king and turned to walk away, as if the matter had already been settled in his mind long before he ever stepped into the hall. Seraphine lowered herself into a slow, graceful curtsy, the kind her mother had trained her to perform since she was a child, the kind that said nothing of what she truly felt. Then she turned and walked out of the hall, her steps steady, her chin lifted, while behind her the whispers grew louder with every step she took. Outside in the palace gardens, away from the eyes of the court, Seraphine finally allowed herself to breathe. She sat on a stone bench beneath a row of blooming trees and stared at her hands, trying to understand what had just happened. She was not naturally a woman who cried easily, but her eyes stung all the same. It was not heartbreak she felt. She barely knew Alaric well enough for that. It was the humiliation. The entire court had watched him reject her as though she were something unwanted, something beneath him, and she had no way to defend herself in that moment. Her lady's maid, Rosalind, found her there a short while later, and sat quietly beside her, saying nothing at first, simply offering her presence as comfort. "He had no right to speak to you that way," Rosalind finally said. "Whatever his reasons, he did not need to shame you in front of the entire court." "No," Seraphine agreed softly. "He did not." She did not yet know that, only a few rooms away, a very different conversation was unfolding, one that would change everything. King Edmund sat in his private study that evening, reading over an old document he had signed 3 days earlier, before Alaric had ever entered the hall. It was a private decree, one that few people in the palace knew existed. The king had grown fond of Seraphine's family over the years, and he respected the promise her father had made to Alaric's father before his passing. To protect that promise, the king had quietly bound Alaric's full inheritance, his title, his lands, and his seat on the royal council, to the completion of that very marriage arrangement. Alaric did not know this. He believed that by refusing Seraphine in public, he had simply and cleanly ended an arrangement he no longer wanted. He believed his rejection had freed him. He was wrong. The next morning, the court gathered again, this time for a much more serious occasion. Alaric arrived dressed formally, ready to take his oath of succession, the ceremony that would confirm him as the rightful duke, with full control of his father's estate and a permanent seat among the king's advisors. He walked forward with the same calm confidence he always carried, expecting the ceremony to proceed exactly as it always did for men of his rank. But when he knelt before the throne and began to speak the words of the oath, the king raised a hand and stopped him. "I cannot accept this oath," King Edmund said, his voice calm but firm, carrying easily through the silent hall. Alaric looked up, confusion crossing his face. for the first time anyone in the court had ever seen. "Your Majesty?" "Yesterday," the king continued, "you stood in this very hall and broke a promise your father made in good faith. You did not simply end an arrangement. You humiliated a woman under the protection of this crown, in front of the entire court, without cause or explanation. A man who cannot honor his father's word, and who treats others with such carelessness, has not yet proven himself worthy of his father's title." Whispers spread quickly through the hall. Alaric's face grew pale. He had expected many things that morning, but not this. "I ask only for what is mine by birth," Alaric said, trying to steady his voice. "A title is not only inherited," the king replied. "It is earned through honor. Until you have shown that you understand what was broken yesterday, this crown will not confirm your succession." The hall buzzed with quiet conversation as Alaric rose slowly to his feet, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. For the first time in his life, the doors that had always opened easily for him remained firmly shut. Word of what had happened spread through the palace like wildfire. Servants whispered it in the hallways. Nobles discussed it quietly over breakfast. By midday, the story had reached every corner of Calderwin Palace. The duke who had rejected a lady before the whole court, only to be rejected himself by the crown he had expected to serve him without question. Seraphine heard the news from Rosalind, who arrived breathless with the story before the ink on the morning's gossip had even dried. "They say the king refused his oath," Rosalind said, sitting across from Seraphine in her private chambers. "He said Alaric was not fit to carry his father's title, not after what he did to you." Seraphine sat quietly for a long moment, trying to understand how she felt. Part of her wanted to feel satisfaction, even relief, at the idea that Alaric was now facing consequences for his cruelty. But another part of her, a part she did not fully understand yet, simply felt tired. She had not asked for revenge. She had only wanted to be treated with basic respect. "What happens now?" she asked. "No one knows," Rosalind admitted, "but the whole court is talking about it." Over the following days, Seraphine noticed a change in how people treated her. Where there had once been pity, and even quiet mockery, there was now a kind of cautious respect. Nobles who had barely acknowledged her before now greeted her warmly in the hallways. She understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that people no longer saw her as a woman who had been cast aside. They saw her as a woman the king himself had chosen to protect. Alaric, meanwhile, found his world shifting in ways he had never expected. Friends who had once sought his company began finding reasons to avoid him. Allies who had smiled and nodded at his rejection of Seraphine now distanced themselves quietly, unwilling to be associated with a man who had fallen out of the king's favor. For the first time, Alaric began to understand that his actions in that hall had cost him more than he ever imagined. He spent many nights in his study, staring at the fire, turning the events over in his mind. He had told himself he had good reasons for what he did: old doubts about the arrangement, pressure from advisors who questioned whether the match truly benefited his house, a stubborn pride that told him he should choose his own path rather than follow his father's plans. But none of those reasons explained why he had chosen to humiliate Seraphine in front of the entire court, rather than speaking with her privately, with honesty and respect. The truth, when he finally admitted it to himself, was simpler and far less flattering. He had wanted to prove that he was in control. He had wanted the court to see him as a man who made his own decisions, not one who simply followed the arrangements his father had made. In his effort to appear strong, he had been cruel. And now, that cruelty had cost him everything he had been trying to protect. 2 weeks after the failed oath ceremony, Alaric requested a private audience with the king. He came without his usual confidence, without the practiced calm he wore like armor. He came, instead, with a simple request, a chance to make things right. "I was wrong," he said, standing before the throne, his voice quieter than the court had ever heard it. "I let my pride guide my actions, and I hurt someone who did not deserve it. I understand now that my title means nothing if I cannot carry it with honor." The king studied him carefully before responding. "Words are easy, Alaric. Actions are harder. If you wish to prove your understanding, you will not prove it to me. You will prove it to her." Alaric understood. He requested a meeting with Seraphine, though he did not expect her to agree. To everyone's surprise, she did. They met in the same garden where Seraphine had once sat alone after her humiliation, though this time the trees were in full bloom, and the afternoon sun cast a gentle warmth over the stone paths. Alaric arrived first, standing quietly near the fountain, unsure of what to say. When Seraphine appeared, calm and composed as always, he found that his carefully prepared words suddenly felt inadequate. "I owe you an apology," he began, "though I know it will not undo what I did." Seraphine studied him for a long moment before responding. "Why did you do it?" Not the excuses you gave the court, the real reason. Alaric hesitated, then answered honestly. I was afraid people would think I was simply following my father's wishes, rather than making my own choices. I thought rejecting the arrangement publicly would prove my strength. Instead, it only proved my weakness. Seraphine nodded slowly, absorbing his words. You could have spoken to me privately. You could have explained your doubts, and we could have found an honest solution together. Instead, you chose to hurt me in front of everyone, simply to protect your own pride. I know, Alaric said quietly, and I am sorry. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the fountain filling the space between them. Seraphine did not offer immediate forgiveness, nor did she demand further apology. She simply allowed the moment to exist, honest and uncomfortable, without pretending it was anything other than what it was. I do not know if I can trust you, she finally said, but I can see that you understand, at least now, what you did wrong. That is more than I expected. In the weeks that followed, Alaric worked quietly to repair what he had broken, not through grand gestures meant to impress the court, but through small, consistent actions. He spoke respectfully of Seraphine whenever her name arose in conversation. He corrected the false rumors that had spread about her character following his public rejection. He supported her family's requests before the council, without asking for recognition or thanks. Seraphine, for her part, did not rush toward forgiveness simply because it was expected of her. She allowed herself time to decide what she truly wanted, free from the pressure of the court's opinions, or even the king's decree. She discovered, during this time, a strength in herself she had not fully recognized before, the ability to stand on her own, regardless of whether Alaric's oath was ever accepted, or their arrangement ever moved forward. When Alaric returned to the throne room a final time to request his oath be reconsidered, the hall was just as full as it had been on that first difficult day. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. There was no cold announcement, no cruel words meant to protect his pride. He knelt before the king with quiet humility. I understand now what it means to carry my father's name, he said. It is not simply about inheritance. It is about the way I treat those around me, especially those I once wronged. The king glanced toward Seraphine, who stood near the front of the gathered nobles. She gave a small, steady nod, not as a sign of forgiveness exactly, but as an acknowledgement that Alaric had, in his own way, tried to make things right. Then let it be known, King Edmund declared, that Duke Alaric Voss has proven himself willing to learn from his mistakes. His oath is accepted. The hall erupted into quiet murmurs, though this time they carried none of the harsh judgment of before. Alaric rose to his feet, his title finally confirmed, though he understood now that the true weight of his new position had nothing to do with the ceremony itself. As for Seraphine, she left the palace that day with no guarantee of marriage, no promise that her future was fully decided. But she left with something far more valuable, the certainty that her worth had never depended on Alaric's approval, nor on the whispered opinions of the court. She had faced public humiliation and walked through it with quiet dignity, and in doing so, she had earned a respect that no royal decree could have given her. Whether she and Alaric would one day stand together as husband and wife remained a question only time could answer. But for now, both of them understood something they had not fully grasped before that difficult day in the Great Hall. That true honor was not found in titles, arrangements, or the opinions of a watching court, but in the simple, difficult choice to treat others with respect, even when it was hardest to do so.